In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the American colonies had gone through profound change. The promise the British government had made the colonies of expanding living space fell through after the British government declared the Appalachian Proclamation that would prevent any settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and left the land to the Native Americans. This angered the American colonists, who felt like they had sacrificed time, lives, and money and deserved new lands to settle upon. Beginning in 1763 with the passage of the Navigation Acts, the British Parliament began to pass laws that were meant to re-exert economic and political control over the American provinces. Up until the 7 Years' War, the American colonial governments had been able to act mostly independent and settle their own affairs without the watchful eye of the British government. After the British spent loads of money fighting in the Americas, they felt that it was fair that the colonists pay taxes to cover the war expenses that had been incurred fighting in their backyard. Following the Navigation Acts, the British passed the Sugar Act, Currency Act, and most famously, the Stamp Act, where the previous tax laws taxed currency, sugar, and trade. The Stamp Act made it possible to tax anything made of paper, and this tax had to be paid in British currency rather than in American colonial currency. This set of taxes passed between 1763 and 1765 angered the colonists. This is when the saying "no taxation without representation" became popular, given that the British were taxing the colonists without having any of their representatives in the British Parliament. These acts were repealed, but were replaced by the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were taxes placed on pretty much any imported good into the American colonies. This once again inflamed tensions between the colonists and the British government. This was the status quo until two events really threw the American Revolution into gear. In 1770, a riot broke out in Boston between the British garrison and the colonists. In all the confusion, the garrison fired upon the colonists. In total, 5 died, including Crispus Attucks, a former slave. This event was also followed 3 years later, in 1773, by the Boston Tea Party. During this time, a group of American colonists by the name of the Sons of Liberty dressed up as natives and raided British merchant ships and dumped all their contents, mostly tea, into the Boston harbor. This event was made to show displeasure against the Tea Act, an act that, I bet you can guess based off of all the other acts, taxed tea. In response to all of this, the British government authorized the deployment of British forces to Boston to control the civil unrest. They also passed the Intolerable Acts, which were meant to punish the colonists who were rebelling and causing unrest in the British colonies. This backfired, though, because contrary to what they believed, this actually caused even more unrest. On April 14, 1775, General Thomas Gage dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to march inland in order to confiscate weapons that the Patriots had stored at Concord and to arrest leaders of what he believed to be a rebellion. Upon hearing this, Paul Revere, a patriot himself, undertook his famous ride into the countryside of Massachusetts, where he warned many of the smaller towns of the British. From there, other riders went off into the Massachusetts countryside, and slowly but surely the entire colony began to understand what was going on. The Minutemen began to form at Lexington and Concord and some of the other smaller towns. These militias were called Minutemen since they could be called up at a moment's notice, anywhere at any time. As the night went on and the British column moved inland, the Minutemen began to group up at Lexington. Captain John Parker stood in Lexington with his 40 Minutemen and waited for the British column. Parker famously said, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but let it begin here if they mean to have a war." A British officer called for the militia to put down their arms, and Captain Parker even told his men to disperse. But Captain Parker was also suffering from tuberculosis, and as such his voice was distorted. Some militia didn't hear him, and instead held their ground. Both sides were in a stalemate. Both held their fire, but there was some unease. Suddenly, a shot rang out from somewhere in the town. This shot, whose origin is still to this day unknown, is now called the shot heard round the world. There was a moment of pause, and then both sides began engaging in sporadic firing. Eventually, the British fixed bayonets and charged. This dispersed the militia. In total, the British had 1 wounded and the Americans had 8 killed. The British column continued to march towards Concord. The Minutemen there had stationed themselves outside the town to gather strength and see what the British planned to do. When the British arrived in Concord, they burned some of the leftover food, 3 cannons, cannon cartridges, and some musket balls. Seeing this and the fact that the British only had light infantry there, the militia moved and approached the town. Over 400 Minutemen formed up against the 95 British soldiers in the town. Seeing this, the British removed themselves from the town and began to pull back across the river. There, a British private fired off what was meant to be a warning shot, but it ended up with 2 British regulars firing off shots that killed 2 American militiamen. Another few British shot and wounded 4 more Americans. The militiamen then fired a volley towards the British, which wounded 4 officers and 9 soldiers and killed 3 soldiers. After this, the British began the long march back to Boston. The entire time, militiamen would harass the British with volleys of musket fire. This guerrilla warfare took its toll, as militia would fire from the trees and hills and just fade away afterwards, leaving dead British soldiers. During this time, the militias from around the entire region began to show up and group up, and by the time the British Army had returned to the relative safety of Boston, 15,000 militiamen began to dig in and lay siege. What was supposed to have been a short, one-day incursion to seize some supplies and rebel leaders had, in about 24 hours, ballooned in scale. Upon hearing about the battles of Lexington and Concord, John Adams, the eventual 2nd President of the United States, rode down to the battle lines. When he saw the true scale of what had occurred, he proclaimed, "This die is cast. The Rubicon is crossed." The American Revolution had begun.